Sachin Henri. The dream of Everest. Picture, if you will, the moment before dawn in the foothills of the Himalayas. The air is thin and sharp, carrying the scent of juniper and the distant promise of snow. In the growing light of March 1924, a small expedition camp stirs to life near Darjeeling. Tents rustling in the mountain breeze, the quiet murmur of voices speaking in half a dozen languages, and somewhere in that collection of canvas and ambition, a man sits writing in his journal by lamplight. His name is George Mallory, and in less than 3 months, he will vanish into the clouds of Mount Everest, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries of human endeavor. You know that feeling, don't you? When you're building something that seems impossible, when everyone asks why you're attempting what others have failed at before, when the sensible voices suggest you turn back, but something deeper pulls you forward. Mallory understood this completely. When pressed by journalists about his obsession with Everest, he gave what would become the most famous 3 words in mountaineering: because it's there. But tonight, as you settle into stillness, we're going to discover that his real answer was far more complex, and perhaps far more familiar to anyone who has ever carried the weight of an impossible dream. The Himalayas in 1924 were not the well-mapped, commercially guided peaks we know today. They were blank spaces on the map where cartographers wrote "unexplored" in careful script. Everest itself, known to the Tibetans as Chomolungma, Mother Goddess of the World, had been identified as the world's highest point only 73 years earlier. No human being had ever stood on its summit. Many believed no human being ever could. The British, in their methodical way, had been probing the mountain's defenses for 3 years. Each expedition had pushed a little higher, learned a little more, and retreated with hard-won knowledge written in frostbite and exhaustion. But 1924 felt different. This would be their 3rd serious attempt, and expedition leader General Charles Bruce had assembled what many considered the strongest team yet sent against any mountain. In that pre-dawn camp near Darjeeling, surrounded by wooden crates stamped with the seals of London suppliers, Mallory was already awake. At 37, he was no longer the young climber who had first glimpsed Everest in 1921. 3 years of Himalayan expeditions had carved lines around his eyes and given him the measured movements of a man who understood the mountain's power. But the fire in him burned as bright as ever. You see, Mallory was not just a climber. He was a teacher, a philosopher, a man who found in the vertical world something that the horizontal world couldn't provide. Before Everest claimed his attention, he had taught at Charterhouse School, inspiring young minds with literature and ideas. His friends included poets and thinkers, people who understood that some pursuits transcend mere achievement. They become questions about what it means to be human. As the sun began to paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold, the expedition camp revealed its true complexity. This was not simply a group of British climbers with ambitious plans. It was a small city of specialists, each carrying their own dreams and fears up the mountain. There was Sandy Irvine, just 22 years old, brilliant with the expedition's experimental oxygen apparatus. While others debated the ethics of using supplemental oxygen, was it somehow cheating? Irvine quietly perfected the temperamental equipment that might mean the difference between success and tragedy. He had the focused intensity you recognize in the best people you've hired. That quality of being completely present in their expertise while seeing possibilities others miss. Captain John Noel operated the expedition's cameras, documenting everything with the eye of someone who understood they were witnessing history. His footage would later become the first major mountaineering film, but in those early morning hours, he was simply a man trying to capture the impossible scale of what they were attempting. The expedition's doctor, Howard Somerville, moved quietly between the tents, checking on the health of porters and climbers alike. He understood better than most what the mountain would demand of human bodies pushed beyond their evolutionary limits. At base camp, the human heart beats twice as fast as it does at sea level, struggling to extract oxygen from air that contains less than half what your lungs expect. But perhaps the most crucial members of the expedition were the ones whose names would rarely appear in the newspaper headlines back in London. The Sherpa porters, led by a remarkable man named Ang Tharke, were the expedition's true foundation. Without them, no Western expedition could survive even a week on Everest's slopes. The Sherpas understood the mountain in ways that no amount of British mountaineering experience could match. They had lived in its shadow for generations, developing not just the physical adaptations necessary for high-altitude life, but the cultural wisdom to read the mountain's moods. They knew which days the wind would howl with enough force to pluck a man from the ridge and hurl him into the void. They could sense when the snow was ready to avalanche, when the weather was building toward one of Everest's legendary storms. Yet in the expedition's official accounts, they were often described simply as porters, as if carrying loads was their only contribution. The reality was far different. Men like Ang Tharke were master mountaineers, capable of moving efficiently at altitudes that left even experienced Western climbers gasping and stumbling. They would carry not just equipment, but often the expedition's hopes, higher up the mountain than seemed humanly possible. Watching them work, Mallory had begun to understand something that would shape his final attempt on the summit. The mountain demanded not just individual excellence, but perfect collaboration. Every successful step higher required dozens of people working in harmony, each playing their part in a complex choreography of logistics, weather, and human endurance. This is something you understand intimately, isn't it? That feeling of knowing your vision depends not just on your own determination, but on the dedication and skill of others who believe in what you're building. The weight you carry includes responsibility, not just for the dream itself, but for all the people who have chosen to share in its risks and possibilities. As the morning light strengthened, revealing the full majesty of the Himalayan range stretching to every horizon, Mallory closed his journal and stepped outside his tent. Somewhere beyond the foothills, hidden behind ridge after ridge of peaks that would themselves be considered giants in any other range, Everest waited. He had seen it before, of course, had spent weeks on its slopes during the previous expeditions, had felt its wind and cold, had pushed higher than any human being before him. But each glimpse of the mountain revealed new complexities, new challenges that demanded creative solutions. The route they planned to attempt was still largely theoretical. From their base camp, they would need to establish a series of higher camps, each one a day's climb above the last, until they reached what they hoped would be a final assault position around 27,000 feet. From there, two climbers would make a desperate push for the summit, racing against weather, exhaustion, and the simple fact that human beings were not designed to survive at such altitudes. The logistics were staggering. Every pound of equipment at the high camps had to be carried there by human effort, often in conditions that made each step a battle against gravity and oxygen deprivation. Food, fuel, tents, sleeping bags, climbing gear, oxygen apparatus, everything had to be positioned precisely, with no room for error or waste. But beyond the logistics lay deeper questions that kept Mallory awake during those pre-dawn hours in Darjeeling. What was it about this mountain that called to something so fundamental in human nature? Why risk everything for a summit that offered no practical benefit, no treasure except the knowledge that you had stood where no one had stood before? These were not idle philosophical questions for Mallory. He was a married man with 3 children waiting for him in England. His wife Ruth had already endured 2 long separations while he pursued his Himalayan dreams. She understood his passion, But she also understood the odds. 2 of every 3 serious attempts on major Himalayan peaks ended in death or permanent injury. Yet here he was, preparing for a 3rd expedition, driven by something he struggled to articulate even to himself. In Letters to Ruth, he wrote about the spirit of adventure and the importance of pushing human boundaries. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he sensed something deeper at work. Perhaps it was the same force that drives anyone to attempt what others consider impossible. The entrepreneur who sees possibility where others see only problems. The inventor who believes a better solution exists, even when experts insist it doesn't. The leader who commits everything to a vision that exists only in imagination, trusting that dedication and skill can make it real. The mountain had become Mallory's impossible startup, his moonshot, his attempt to prove that human determination could overcome any obstacle. And like every true entrepreneur, he had reached the point where turning back felt more impossible than pushing forward. As the expedition prepared to leave Darjeeling and begin the long approach march to Everest, Mallory took one last look at the distant peaks, now fully illuminated by the risen sun. Somewhere in that maze of ice and stone lay the answer to questions he had been carrying for 3 years. He could not know that in less than 3 months those questions would become eternal, and that nearly a century later we would still be searching for answers in the thin air where dreams and reality meet. But that morning in March, with the whole expedition ahead of them, anything seemed possible. The mountain waited, patient and eternal, ready to test everything they had learned about courage, partnership, and the price of impossible dreams. Base camp and the ascent begins. The journey to base camp would take them through landscapes that seemed carved from another world entirely. As they left the familiar rhythms of Darjeeling behind, the expedition moved like a small civilization on the march. Porters carrying loads that would have broken lesser men. Yaks stepping carefully along paths that had been worn smooth by centuries of trade and pilgrimage. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when you commit fully to something that will test every assumption you've held about what's possible. When the comfortable world falls away behind you, and ahead lies only the unknown territory you've chosen to enter. For Mallory, each day brought them closer to the mountain that had been calling to him across 3 years of restless nights. But he was not alone in feeling that pull. Among the climbers making this journey was a young man whose name would become forever linked with mystery. Andrew Irvine. At 22, Irvine possessed that particular kind of fearlessness that comes from not yet having learned what should be impossible. An engineering student from Oxford, he had been chosen not for his mountaineering experience, which was modest, but for his mechanical brilliance and his ability to coax life from the primitive oxygen apparatus they would need in the death zone above 26,000 feet. Picture him there, walking beside the heavily laden yaks, his mind already working on modifications to equipment that might mean the difference between success and disaster. The weight he carried was different from Mallory's philosophical burden. It was the practical weight of knowing that lives would depend on valves and regulators functioning perfectly in conditions no machine had been designed to endure. Then there was Noel Odell, the expedition's geologist, whose steady presence would prove crucial in the days ahead. Odell carried the scientist's particular burden, the need to observe and record, even when the heart yearned to simply experience the wonder of where they were going. He understood that this expedition was as much about mapping the limits of human endurance as it was about reaching a summit. And John Noel, not to be confused with Odell, the expedition's photographer, who bore perhaps the heaviest burden of all. He carried the weight of documentation, knowing that whatever happened on the mountain, the world would judge their efforts by the images he managed to capture. In an age before satellite communication, before instant global connection, he was their link to the millions who would never set foot on such terrain, but who hungered to understand what drove men to attempt the impossible. When they finally reached base camp at 17,000 feet, the mountain revealed itself in all its terrible majesty. Everest rose before them like a great pyramid of stone and ice, its summit hidden more often than not in plumes of snow that streamed from the peak like prayer flags written by the wind. Base camp itself was a study in organized chaos, a temporary city of canvas and rope, scattered across the rocky moraine of the Rongbuk Glacier. Here, in this harsh amphitheater, they would spend weeks preparing for the ascent, acclimatizing their bodies to air so thin that every breath was a conscious effort. The daily routine became a meditation on preparation. Each morning brought the ritual of checking equipment, testing oxygen sets, studying weather patterns that could change from benign to lethal in minutes. The Sherpas moved through these tasks with the fluid efficiency of men who understood that attention to detail was not perfectionism. It was survival. You understand this rhythm, don't you? The way that important work creates its own cadence, its own demands for precision. The way that building something meaningful requires you to master 1,000 small things before you can attempt the one great thing that brought you here. As the days passed, they began their reconnaissance missions, carefully planned forays up the lower slopes of the mountain. These were not attempts at the summit, but rather a methodical process of learning the mountain's moods, identifying the route that might, just might, offer a path to the top. The North Col, at 23,000 feet, became their first major objective. Reaching it required crossing terrain that shifted between beauty and menace with each step. Crevasses hidden beneath thin layers of snow could swallow a man without warning. Ice walls rose like frozen waterfalls, requiring hours of careful cutting and climbing for each 100 feet of progress. But it was on these initial climbs that the true character of the expedition revealed itself. Watch Mallory moving across a field of broken ice, his movements economical and precise, reading the mountain like a text written in a language only he seemed to understand. See young Irvine, his face flushed with the effort of breathing at altitude, but his hands still steady as he adjusts the oxygen equipment that might prove crucial in the weeks ahead. The tent became their sanctuary in this vertical wilderness, a small dome of yellow canvas that represented civilization in a landscape that seemed designed to strip away everything familiar. Inside, by the light of a single candle, they would plan the next day's route, share the simple meals that were all their bodies could process at this altitude, and confront the growing weight of what lay ahead. It was here, in the intimacy of shared exhaustion, that the true partnerships of the expedition were forged. Mallory and Irvine began to develop the wordless communication that would be essential if they were to attempt the summit together. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's strengths and limitations. The mountain, meanwhile, continued to test them. Weather systems would roll in without warning, bringing winds that could knock a man off his feet and temperatures that made exposed flesh freeze in minutes. On clear days, the summit seemed almost close enough to touch, a cruel illusion that every mountaineer learns to distrust. As they pushed higher on their acclimatization climbs, the landscape became increasingly alien. Above 24,000 feet, they entered what climbers call the death zone, altitude at which the human body begins to consume itself, where every hour spent is borrowed time that must eventually be repaid. Here, on the upper slopes of the North Face, they encountered terrain that seemed designed to break human ambition. Loose rock that crumbled at a touch, ice formations that appeared solid but could collapse without warning. And always, the relentless wind that seemed to carry voices, whispers of all who had dreamed of standing where they now struggled to simply breathe. But with each day, each careful step higher, they were learning. Learning the mountain's patterns, its moods, its moments of vulnerability when the weather might offer a brief window of opportunity. They were becoming something more than the sum of their individual abilities. They were becoming a team capable of attempting what no human being had ever achieved. The weight they carried was no longer just personal ambition. It was the accumulated hopes of everyone who had ever looked at something impossible and wondered, what if? What if human determination could overcome the simple physics of altitude and cold and wind? What if the summit that had never known a human footprint might finally yield to careful planning, steady courage, and the kind of partnership that transforms individual limitation into collective possibility? The high camps and the oxygen dilemma. But first, they had to build the ladder to heaven itself. Above base camp, the mountain revealed its true architecture of suffering. Each camp would be a stepping stone higher into air so thin it barely deserved the name. Camp I at 17,000 feet. Camp 2 at 19,000. Camp 3 perched impossibly at 21,000 feet on the North Col, a wind-scoured shelf of ice where the mountain's fury concentrated into something almost personal. And then, Camp 4, 23,000 feet above the sea, higher than most mountains dream of reaching, a place where the human body begins its slow surrender to physics, where every breath becomes a conscious act of will rather than the automatic rhythm that has sustained you since birth. You know this feeling, don't you? Not the altitude, perhaps, but that moment when the systems you've always relied upon begin to falter. When the energy that once seemed limitless starts rationing itself. When you realize that what you're attempting will require more than what you naturally possess. The establishment of Camp Warfort took weeks of grinding labor. Porters carrying loads that would challenge a pack animal at sea level, now moving with the deliberate pace of deep-sea divers through an atmosphere that offered perhaps a third of the oxygen their bodies craved. Each step calculated, each breath precious. Mallory described it in his journal, the peculiar sensation of watching his own hand move as if through thick liquid. Simple tasks, tying a knot, opening a tin of food, becoming elaborate exercises in concentration. The mountain was teaching them the difference between what the mind could conceive and what the body could execute. And this is where Andrew Irvine became indispensable. Young Irvine, barely 22, with his engineer's mind and steady hands. While others struggled with the basic mechanics of existence at altitude, he maintained their lifeline to the impossible, the oxygen apparatus. Picture these devices. Not the sleek equipment you might imagine, but brass and steel contraptions that belonged more in a Victorian laboratory than on a mountainside. Cylinders weighing 14 pounds each, connected by rubber tubing to masks that covered half the face. Primitive, temperamental, absolutely essential. The oxygen flow had to be calibrated precisely. Too little, and the climber gained no advantage over the crushing altitude. Too much, and the precious supply would exhaust itself long before the summit. Each tank contained perhaps 6 hours of supplemental breathing. If everything worked perfectly, if the valves didn't freeze, if the tubing didn't crack in the cold, if the regulator didn't jam at 26,000 feet with the summit still 1,000 feet above. Irvine understood these machines like a craftsman understands his tools. While Mallory studied the route, calculating distances and weather windows, Irvine studied flow rates and pressure gauges. He could strip and rebuild a regulator by headlamp, his bare fingers working metal that was painful to touch in the sub-zero darkness of their tent. The other expeditions, the attempts that came before, They had failed here, at this precise intersection of human limitation and mechanical reliability. Bodies that could endure, but equipment that couldn't. Or equipment that functioned, but bodies that had already given everything they possessed just reaching this point. From Camp 4, the summit route revealed itself with terrible clarity. The northeast ridge, a knife edge of snow and stone leading toward the pyramid summit that seemed to float in the thin air above them. But between their position and that ultimate prize lay obstacles that redefined the meaning of difficulty. The second step, a vertical cliff of rock at 28,000 feet that would challenge a fresh climber at sea level. Here, it became a puzzle to be solved while the mind struggled with oxygen starvation and the body operated on reserves it didn't know it possessed. The other team members made their attempts first. Norton and Somerville, climbing without oxygen, pushing themselves into that realm where human physiology simply stops cooperating. They reached higher than anyone before them, but the mountain extracted its price. Somerville, coughing so violently at altitude that he damaged his throat. Norton, his vision beginning to fail in the thin air, seeing double, unable to judge distances that meant the difference between a successful step and a fatal fall. They returned to Camp 4 changed men. Not defeated exactly, but marked by the encounter with their own limits. They had touched the edge of what was humanly possible and found it just short of sufficient. This is the mathematics of attempting the impossible, isn't it? You can optimize everything: the equipment, the strategy, the timing, the team. But there remains that final variable that no amount of preparation can fully account for. The moment when everything you've built encounters the immovable reality of what you're trying to achieve. Mallory and Irvine watched their teammates return. They saw the exhaustion, the quiet disappointment, the way Norton's eyes struggled to focus even hours after his descent. They understood that their own attempt would require something more than careful planning and steady courage. It would require a kind of partnership that transcended individual capability. Mallory brought the mountaineering experience, the deep knowledge of snow and rock and weather that comes from years of intimate conversation with mountains. But Irvine brought something equally crucial, the mechanical sympathy that could keep their oxygen flowing when the equipment wanted to fail. The engineer's mind that could solve problems in real time while the body struggled just to maintain consciousness. Together, they represented something new in the history of human ambition, not just the marriage of experience and youth, but the fusion of intuitive skill with technical precision. The artist and the engineer, both essential, neither sufficient alone, as they prepared for their attempt, checking and rechecking the oxygen apparatus by lamplight in their tent. The weight they carried had evolved again. It was no longer just personal ambition, or even the hopes of those who believed in the possibility of the impossible. It was the accumulated understanding of everyone who had tried and fallen just short. The knowledge purchased with Norton's damaged vision and Somerville's injured throat. The hard-won wisdom of every porter who had carried loads to these impossible heights, every previous expedition that had mapped another piece of the puzzle. They were inheriting not just the dream of the summit, but the responsibility to honor everything that had been invested in reaching this moment. Every careful calculation, every act of courage, every small technical innovation that had brought them to this tent at 23,000 feet, preparing to attempt what no human being had ever achieved. The mountain waited above them, indifferent to their preparations, governed by laws of physics that cared nothing for human determination. But they had built something here, a ladder of camps and cached supplies, of partnerships and accumulated knowledge, of mechanical ingenuity and sheer stubborn refusal to accept the impossible as permanent. Tomorrow, they would discover whether it was enough. Mallory and Irvine's final ascent. The morning of June 8th dawned clear at 23,000 feet, a gift from the mountain that neither man took for granted. In the gray light filtering through their tent walls at Camp 4, Mallory and Irvine moved with the deliberate economy of those who understood that every action now carried weight beyond its simple execution. You know this feeling. The morning of the presentation that will determine your company's future. The day you must deliver news that will change everything for your team. That careful choreography of preparation when failure is not merely disappointing, but potentially catastrophic. Irvine worked methodically on their oxygen apparatus, his engineer's mind focused on the mechanical details that would mean the difference between summit and survival. The cylinders were temperamental at best, prone to freezing, to leaking, to the 1,000 small failures that plagued early technology pushed beyond its intended limits. But they were also their lifeline in the death zone above, where the air held barely a third of the oxygen their bodies craved. Mallory watched his young partner's preparations with quiet confidence. In the weeks since leaving Darjeeling, he had come to trust Irvine's technical instincts completely. Here was someone who understood that innovation meant nothing without reliability, that the most elegant solution was worthless if it failed when needed most. The weight you carry as a leader often includes this same dynamic. The balance between pushing boundaries and ensuring the fundamentals hold firm. Between the vision that drives you forward and the practical details that determine whether you arrive at all. By 8 in the morning, they were ready. The oxygen flowed steadily through their primitive masks, a mechanical whisper that would accompany every step of their ascent. Their packs contained spare cylinders, emergency food, and little else. At this altitude, every ounce mattered more than comfort, more than contingency, more than anything except the essential tools of survival. The route above Camp 4 led immediately into terrain that tested every skill they had accumulated over decades of climbing. The first step rose before them like a vertical wall of limestone and snow. 60 feet of technical climbing at an altitude where most men could barely stand upright. Mallory led, his movements precise, despite the bulk of the oxygen apparatus on his back. Each placement of hand and foot required calculation, not just of the rock's stability, but of his body's remaining reserves, of the oxygen flowing through his mask, of the time ticking away toward the afternoon winds that would make descent treacherous. Behind him, Irvine climbed with the steady determination that had marked his character since Cambridge. The young man's engineering background served him well here. He understood systems under stress, the importance of redundancy, the way small failures could cascade into catastrophic ones. This is the reality of building something meaningful. Those moments when all your preparation distills into immediate, consequential action. When the months of planning and the years of experience must translate into decisions made in seconds, with incomplete information, under conditions that test every assumption you've made about your own capabilities. Beyond the first step, the ridge narrowed to a knife edge of snow and rock. The world fell away on both sides. To the north, the brown vastness of Tibet stretched to the horizon. To the south, the green valleys of Nepal lay hidden beneath layers of cloud. They moved along this aerial highway with the focused attention of men who understood that a single misplaced step would end not just their summit attempt, but their lives. The second step loomed ahead, a more formidable obstacle than the first. Here, the mountain presented them with a 100-foot cliff of near-vertical rock, its holds hidden beneath decades of accumulated ice and snow. This was the crux, the technical challenge that would determine whether their route to the summit remained viable or became a dead end in the sky. Mallory approached the base of the second step with the methodical assessment of a master craftsman examining an unfamiliar tool. He tested holds, cleared ice from potential anchor points, calculated angles and distances with the accumulated wisdom of 20 years spent solving vertical puzzles. The oxygen apparatus, so crucial for survival at this altitude, now became an additional complication. The cylinders threw off his balance. The mask restricted his vision. The tubes caught on rock projections and threatened to pull him off balance at crucial moments. Yet, they climbed, foot by foot, hold by hold. They solved the puzzle of the second step through a combination of technical skill and sheer determination. Irvine's youth served him well here. His strength less diminished by the accumulated fatigue of the expedition, his recovery between difficult moves faster than his older partners. You understand this dynamic in what you're building, the way experience and energy must work together, each compensating for the other's limitations, the way the best partnerships leverage different strengths toward a common goal that neither could achieve alone. Above the second step, the ridge continued toward the summit pyramid, still hours away, still hundreds of feet above them, but now within the realm of the possible. The route ahead looked manageable, steep but not technical, demanding endurance more than climbing skill. It was here, at approximately 12:50 in the afternoon, that Noel Odell made his fateful sighting from the slopes below. Odell had been climbing in support, carrying supplies to the higher camps and monitoring the weather conditions. As he worked his way up the North Col route, a break in the clouds revealed the upper reaches of the mountain, and two small figures moving along the skyline ridge. The sighting lasted only moments before the clouds closed in again. But in that brief window, Odell saw what appeared to be Mallory and Irvine surmounting one of the major rock obstacles, making progress toward the summit at a pace that suggested success remained possible. His field notes, written that evening back at camp, recorded the observation with scientific precision. But they could not capture the emotional weight of that moment. The realization that he was witnessing either the culmination of centuries of human dreaming about Everest's summit, or the last time anyone would see his friends alive. The clouds that swallowed Mallory and Irvine after Odell's sighting would not lift again that day. Whatever happened in the hours that followed, whether they reached the summit, whether they began their descent, whether they found shelter, or were caught by the mountain's evening fury, all of it occurred beyond the reach of human witness. This is perhaps the most profound aspect of their story, the way it disappears into mystery at the moment of greatest consequence. Like so many of the decisions you make in building what matters to you, the most crucial moments often happen in solitude, witnessed only by your own conscience and the indifferent forces that govern the world around you. The mountain kept its secrets. The two men, with all their skill and determination and carefully planned equipment, passed beyond the edge of the known world and into the realm of legend. What they found there, triumph or tragedy, success or surrender, remains one of mountaineering's greatest questions. But what they had already accomplished was beyond dispute. They had pushed human possibility to its absolute limit, armed with nothing more than primitive equipment, accumulated knowledge, and the kind of partnership that transforms individual capability into something greater than the sum of its parts. The last sighting. The partnership they had forged, this understanding between experience and innovation, would soon be tested by forces beyond human control. For even as Mallory and Irvine pushed upward through that thin air, the mountain was already beginning to reclaim them. Noel Odell, geologist and climber, had spent that morning of June 8th working his way up from Camp 3. His task was scientific, collecting rock samples, making observations, but his heart carried something heavier. The weight of being the last link in a chain that stretched all the way back to Darjeeling, to London, to every person who had invested their hopes in this impossible dream. The weather that day was unsettled. Clouds moved across the upper reaches of Everest like living things, revealing and concealing the mountain's highest mysteries. Odell climbed steadily through the morning, his eyes constantly drawn upward, searching for any sign of his companions somewhere in that vertical wilderness above. You know this feeling, perhaps. That moment when everything you've built, everything you've worked toward, hangs in the balance beyond your direct control, when all you can do is watch and wait, and trust in the partnerships you've forged along the way. At 12:50 in the afternoon, Odell reached a small rocky crest at about 26,000 feet. The effort had been considerable, each step a negotiation with the thin air. But as he paused to catch his breath, something extraordinary happened. The clouds that had been shrouding the upper mountain suddenly parted, like curtains drawn back to reveal a stage. And there, impossibly high above him, moving along the ridge that led toward the summit, were two tiny figures. The distance was immense. At that altitude, in that light, human beings became mere dots against the vast canvas of rock and snow. But Odell knew, with the certainty that comes from months of shared hardship, that he was looking at Mallory and Irvine, still climbing, still pushing upward toward their impossible goal. He watched them navigate what appeared to be a rocky step, one of the technical challenges they had studied and planned for during those long evenings in camp. The movement was deliberate, methodical, the kind of careful progress that spoke of climbers still in control of their situation, still working together as the partnership they had become. The sighting lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then the clouds closed in again, and the upper mountain disappeared behind that veil of white and gray. Odell remained there for some time, hoping for another break in the weather, another glimpse of his friends. But the mountain had revealed all it intended to reveal that day. What Odell had witnessed would become one of mountaineering's most analyzed moments. The exact location of that rocky step, the precise time of the sighting, the significance of their apparent progress. All of it would be debated for decades. But in that moment, watching through the brief window the mountain had provided, Odell felt something simpler: pride, hope, the satisfaction of seeing a plan unfold as intended. He began his descent to Camp 4, expecting to find Mallory and Irvine there by evening. The summit attempt, successful or not, should bring them back to the relative safety of their high camp before darkness fell. That was the plan they had all agreed upon, the careful calculation that balanced ambition with survival. But as the afternoon wore on, as shadows began to lengthen across the upper reaches of the mountain, Camp 4 remained empty. Odell arrived at the camp as evening approached. The silence there was profound. Not just the absence of human voices, but something deeper. The kind of quiet that carries weight, that suggests questions without easy answers. He prepared signal flashes with his torch, the agreed-upon communication that would guide his companions back to safety. The light cut through the gathering darkness, a beacon of human intention against the mountain's vast indifference. But there was no response from above. No answering signal from the heights where Mallory and Irvine had last been seen. The night that followed was unlike any other in Odell's experience. Not just the physical discomfort of sleeping alone at 23,000 feet, though that was considerable, but the psychological weight of uncertainty, of being the last person to have seen his friends alive, and not knowing what that sighting truly meant. You understand this weight, perhaps. Those moments when the success or failure of what you're building, the safety of those who depend on you, hangs in a balance you cannot directly influence. When all your planning, all your preparation, all your careful partnerships must speak for themselves in circumstances you cannot control. The morning of June 9th brought no relief. Odell climbed higher, hoping to find some trace of Mallory and Irvine's passage, some indication of what had become of them. But the mountain revealed nothing. The snow above Camp 4 was unmarked by human passage. The rocky steps they had studied so carefully showed no signs of recent climbing. It was as if the mountain had simply absorbed them, taken two of the finest climbers of their generation and woven them into its own story, leaving behind only questions and the memory of that brief sighting through the clouds. The search that followed would be limited by the brutal realities of high-altitude mountaineering. Oxygen supplies were running low. The weather was deteriorating. The other members of the expedition were already pushed beyond their limits by weeks of effort at extreme altitude. There comes a point, even in the most carefully planned endeavors, where the cost of continuing exceeds what human endurance can sustain. But the questions would endure long after the expedition retreated from the mountain. Had Mallory and Irvine reached the summit? Had they achieved the goal that had drawn them across continents and up through those camps carved from ice and determination? Or had they fallen short, claimed by the mountain just beneath their ultimate objective? The ambiguity of Odell's sighting, that brief glimpse through parting clouds, would fuel speculation for generations. Some would argue that the climbers' apparent progress suggested success. Others would point to the technical challenges still ahead, the primitive nature of their equipment, the approaching darkness that would have complicated any descent. What remained undisputed was the courage of the attempt itself, the willingness to push human possibility to its absolute limit, knowing that the margin between triumph and tragedy at such altitudes was measured in moments, in the reliability of equipment, in the strength of partnerships forged through shared hardship. In the end, perhaps that was the true summit they had reached. Not a geographical point marked on maps, but something more fundamental. The demonstration that human beings, working together with careful planning and absolute commitment, could touch the very edge of what their world thought possible. The mountain had kept its secrets, but it could not diminish what they had already accomplished, or the inspiration their courage would provide for everyone who came after, carrying their own weight toward their own impossible peaks. The mystery endures. The silence that followed would stretch across decades, becoming one of mountaineering's most enduring mysteries. In the days after Mallory and Irvine vanished, their teammates faced the agonizing reality of empty sleeping bags and cold tea. Noel Odell climbed higher than any human being ever had, searching desperately through the thin air for any sign of his friends. He found nothing but wind-carved snow and the vast indifference of stone. The expedition descended in stages, each camp abandoned in turn, leaving behind the detritus of extraordinary ambition. Oxygen cylinders that had carried such hope, tents that had sheltered dreams of glory. At Camp 6, 26,000 feet above the sea, 2 sleeping bags lay waiting for climbers who would never return to fill them. What had happened in those final hours? The question would haunt mountaineers for generations. Perhaps they had reached the summit, stood together on that wind-swept pinnacle where earth meets sky, sharing a moment of triumph before the mountain claimed them on the descent. The summit ridge of Everest is a knife edge of snow and rock, where exhausted climbers must navigate treacherous terrain while fighting the effects of oxygen starvation. Or perhaps they had fallen short, turned back just hundreds of feet from their goal, when failing equipment or deteriorating weather made the summit attempt impossible. The primitive oxygen apparatus of 1924 was notoriously unreliable. A frozen valve, a blocked tube. Any mechanical failure at that altitude could transform hope into catastrophe within minutes. The camera that Andrew Irvine carried might have held the answer. A simple Kodak that could have contained the most significant photographs in mountaineering history. Images of two figures standing on the highest point on Earth, 29 years before Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay received credit for the first ascent. But the camera, like so much else about that final day, remained lost in the mountain's vast architecture of ice and stone. For 75 years, Everest kept its secrets. Expeditions came and went, each adding layers to the mountain's growing mythology. The North Face, where Mallory and Irvine had made their attempt, became forbidden territory when Tibet closed its borders. The mystery deepened in isolation, protected by politics and geography from the scrutiny of modern mountaineering. Then, in 1999, an expedition specifically searching for traces of the lost climbers made an extraordinary discovery. At 27,000 feet, preserved in the mountain's natural deep freeze, they found George Mallory himself. His body lay face down on a rocky ledge, arms extended as if he had tried to arrest a fall. The mountain's brutal conditions had mummified him perfectly. His clothing, his equipment, even the letters in his pocket from his wife Ruth, all frozen in time since that June day in 1924. The discovery answered some questions while deepening others. Mallory's injuries suggested a fall. But from where? His snow goggles were in his pocket, rather than protecting his eyes, indicating he had either been climbing in darkness or poor visibility. But climbers of that era typically started their summit attempts before dawn, so this detail revealed little about whether he was ascending toward triumph or descending from it. Most tantalizingly, the camera was not with Mallory's body. If Irvine had been carrying it when they separated, if it lay somewhere higher on the mountain, those photographs might still exist, waiting in the cold darkness for someone to retrieve them. The weight of not knowing settles differently on different people. Some find comfort in the mystery itself, in the idea that certain questions are more powerful than their answers. Others feel the absence like a physical ache, a puzzle demanding solution. You understand this feeling, perhaps. The projects where you never learned whether your bold decision was right or wrong. The partnerships that ended without resolution. The ventures that simply disappeared into the complexity of circumstance and time, leaving you to wonder what might have been different with one more conversation, one different choice, one additional month of runway. In the business you're building, you face your own version of Everest's silence. Markets that respond in ways you cannot predict. Customers whose motivations remain opaque, despite all your research. Team members who leave for opportunities you never saw coming, taking with them knowledge and relationships that cannot be easily replaced. The mystery endures because some stories resist simple conclusions. Mallory and Irvine's final day exists now in the realm of possibility rather than fact, where courage and tragedy interweave in ways that speak to something fundamental about human ambition. Their empty tent at Camp 6 stands as a monument to questions that may never be answered. But perhaps that uncertainty itself has become their greatest legacy. A reminder that the most meaningful endeavors often lead us into territory where success and failure become difficult to distinguish, where the attempt itself transforms into something larger than its outcome. Whispers of the Mountain. In the gathering dusk of the Himalayas, where the last light catches the snow crystals dancing in the thin air, Mount Everest stands as it has for millennia, indifferent to human ambition, yet somehow calling to something deep within us that refuses to accept the impossible. The mountain's north face, bathed now in the soft purple shadows of evening, holds its secrets close. The same face that Mallory and Irvine disappeared into on that June morning nearly a century ago. You know this feeling, don't you? This pull toward something that others might call unreasonable. This willingness to venture into territory where the outcome cannot be guaranteed, where the very act of trying becomes its own form of victory. What you're building, the weight you carry, the decisions that keep you awake at this very hour, they share something fundamental with those two figures who vanished into the clouds above the second step. The wind that moves across Everest's summit tonight carries with it the whispers of every dreamer who has ever stood at the edge of the known world and taken one more step forward. It speaks of Mallory, who, when asked why he wanted to climb Everest, gave that famous reply, "Because it's there." But perhaps the deeper truth lies in what he didn't say, that some mountains exist not just in geography, but in the human spirit, and until we attempt them, we remain forever wondering who we might have become. The ice axe found high on the mountain in 1933. Lying alone on a rocky ledge, its wooden handle worn smooth by determined hands, has become more than an artifact. It rests there still, a testament to the moment when preparation meets possibility, when all the planning and dreaming and careful calculation gives way to pure forward motion. Like the decisions you make in those quiet hours before dawn, when the world sleeps and you alone carry the vision of what could be. In the camps below, where expeditions still gather each climbing season, the story of Mallory and Irvine is told and retold around flickering stoves. But it's not really a story about mountaineering. It's a story about the courage to pursue something larger than yourself, knowing that the attempt itself will change you in ways you cannot predict. The Sherpa guides speak of the mountain with reverence, understanding something that perhaps Mallory glimpsed in those final moments. The true summits are often invisible, marked not by standing on a particular piece of ground, but by becoming the person capable of the attempt. The mystery that surrounds their final hours has grown more beautiful with time, not less. Did they reach the summit? Did they stand together on the highest point on Earth, looking out over a world spread below them like a map of dreams realized? The mountain keeps its counsel. But in that silence lies a deeper wisdom about the nature of achievement itself. You understand this, lying here in the darkness, how the most meaningful victories often happen in moments no one else witnesses. The decision to continue when continuation seems impossible. The choice to maintain your vision when others counsel retreat. The quiet determination to take one more step up your own north face, even when the summit remains hidden in clouds. The snowflakes that fall on Everest tonight settle onto stone and ice with the same gentle persistence that has shaped mountains for millions of years. Each flake is insignificant, yet together they become glaciers. They become the very substance of the mountain itself. Your daily efforts, the small decisions that no one else sees, the incremental progress that feels inadequate in the moment, they accumulate with the same quiet power. As the stars emerge over the Himalayas, brilliant in the thin air at 29,000 feet, they illuminate a landscape that has witnessed countless attempts, countless dreams made manifest in ice and stone. Some climbers return with summit photos. Others return with something less tangible but perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that they ventured to the edge of their capabilities and discovered reserves they never knew existed. The empty tent at Camp 6, mentioned in the expedition records with such poignant brevity, reminds us that every great endeavor requires us to leave something behind. The person we were before we began. The comfortable certainty of staying within known limits. Mallory and Irvine left more than their tent. They left the safety of the possible and ventured into the realm of the extraordinary. Tonight, As you finally allow your mind to release its grip on tomorrow's challenges, let the mountain's ancient patience become your own. Let its willingness to stand unchanged, while weather and seasons rage around it, remind you that some things endure not through force, but through presence. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the attempt to build something meaningful, to carry weight that others cannot see, to climb toward summits that exist as much in vision as in reality, creates its own form of victory that needs no witness except the quiet satisfaction of knowing you answered the call when it came. And like those two figures who disappeared into legend on a June morning in 1924, you chose to take one more step toward the impossible, rather than remain forever wondering what lay beyond the clouds.